So the third category that we were going to talk about, and I may just pose a question or two. We were going to talk about characters, right? So maybe
I think we've already covered.
Yeah. But, we've gone through almost 10 chapters of Living Stones, and we've talked about a lot of people.
Mm-hmm.
Who, Monsignor Kupke, is in the history of the diocese, who is your hero? Who is one of your... That's
the opposite direction I thought we were going in.
Yeah, well, I'll ask it the other way. But I was just wondering, is there somebody that inspires you, that you just admire and would like to emulate, and maybe is your kind of unsung patron saint in some way?
You're going to be caught by surprise by this. I'm going to give a talk in a couple of months at the seminary about holy characters that have come out of the seminary at Seton Hall. And one of my characters is going to be Vince Malloy.
Father Vince Malloy?
Yeah.
Yeah, so Father Vincent Malloy was a diocesan priest who ended up teaching in the seminary and was the pastor of St. Peter's in Parsippany when I got there for 3 weeks.
Right.
Yeah.
But at Vinny's funeral, Vince was ordained in 59-60. The worst time in some ways to be ordained. These are the guys, one of his classmates said that to me, that he expected that someday, all the priests of his era were going to be beatified as a group, as the martyrs of Vatican II.
Wow.
Because these are the guys that were trained in the old system, and just as they were ordained, everything changed. And they had to deal with it. And the attrition rate was awful.
That's the era where many guys left. Yeah.
They couldn't handle the transition. But Vince is in that era, and at his funeral,
it's not that long ago.
Well, it is. You're just
okay.
One of his classmates gave a really lamentable homily.
I was there.
It was really
tough.
Awful. It was
it was kind of grinding an axe.
It was very political, and Vince put up with the bishops, and Vince, it was really terrible. So it left a sour taste in your mouth. And when the whole thing was over, at the end, one of his nephews got up and spoke for like 5 minutes on behalf of the family. And he told a story about Vince. Vince was very quiet, and he was brilliant, very, very educated, but...
he was a seminary professor rather than the gregarious pastor type. Yeah.
So the nephew was in Washington, and Vince was teaching in Emmitsburg, Maryland, which is not that far from
Mount
Washington.
St. Mary's, yeah.
So he came down to Washington to go out to lunch with his nephew. So they're walking along the street to the restaurant, and all of a sudden Vince runs into somebody he knows, and they start talking. So the nephew moved on a little bit to give them some space, because they were obviously catching up on having not seen each other for a long time. So finally, they break up, and Vince catches up with his nephew, and the nephew says to him, that was really, a coincidence that you would run into somebody you knew, as we're going. And Vince said to the nephew, I never saw that woman before in my life. And he says, then he laughs, he chuckles a little bit, and he says to the nephew, I hope you have some money for lunch, because I just gave that woman everything I have.
Wow. Yeah. Yeah.
And that was a classic Vince Malloy.
Yeah. Yeah. And I'm amazed that you remember this.
How could you forget a story like that?
Well, some of us do. All right. So that is your kind of unsung hero, maybe. Yeah. Were you gonna
I was going to
give us
mention
another character?
I was going to mention two characters, I think. The patriarch of the Italian Catholic community in Paterson for many years was Monsignor Carlo Cianci.
There's a street named after him
In Paterson, right.
Cianci Street.
Cianci Street. He was the pastor of St. Michael's in Paterson for like 40-some years and had succeeded his uncle, Father Felice Cianci, in the same parish. So these people thought that Cianci was the Italian word for pastor because they had but Cianci was a character, and he very, very much appreciated his role as the patriarch of the Italian Catholic community. He's the one that brought the Salesians to New Jersey.
Wasn't he the pastor of Gene Romano at some point?
No.
Okay, sorry.
No, that was Mealy.
Oh, that's another story
That's
I'm thinking
another-
about. Maybe, yeah, we'll do that that's the episode that we have to bleep out some
Right,
things.
right.
Sorry.
So the story is that Cianci, you might not know this, but there are 3 grades of Monsignor. There are honorary chaplains, honorary prelates, and protonotaries apostolic. So Cianci had, at this point, as succeeding bishops had come in and wanted to honor Cianci for his role as, the father of the Italians in Paterson. He had been moved through all 3 of these grades. He was now at the top of the heap. They weren't going to make him a bishop, but he was top rank Monsignor.
With slight variations in what you could wear.
Right.
Yeah.
Yeah. So all of a sudden, his assistant, Father Joe Gallo, was made a Monsignor.
Which
This
would be
was-
atypical.
It was not atypical, was unheard of. So much so that once he was made, Gallo went to Bishop McNulty and said, so I presume you're going to make me a pastor. And McNulty says, no. He said, I made you a Monsignor because you're in charge of, development of the clergy. It has nothing to do with, you're not going to be made a pastor. No. You just go back and be Cianci's assistant. So this was a very unusual situation to have. He was the only one in the state, certainly. He might have been the only one in the country that was a parochial vicar, but was a Monsignor as well. So in Cianci's world, this made perfect sense, because they had run out of ways to honor him. So now they had invented a new way to honor him by giving him an assistant who was a Monsignor. So from there on, whenever Cianci would answer the phone and somebody would say, Monsignor, he would say in his little Italian accent, you want the bigger Monsignor or do you want the little Monsignor? The other one that you could write a book about is the first chancellor of the diocese, Monsignor Bill Lewis. Father Lewis was the one who built St. Brendan's in Clifton, but he was also the chancellor of the diocese at a time when the diocesan headquarters only had 2 people that worked full-time.
Vera Mullane.
Vera Mullane,
Yeah, the
and the
secretary.
secretary of the school office.
Oh, wow.
You know, and
The
that was
bishop's
it.
secretary and the school office
Yeah,
secretary.
those were the only. You know, it was a very, very meager operation. You know, so the first bishop dies.
McLaughlin.
And McLaughlin. No, I'm sorry. This is not. It's at the changeover from the second to the third bishop. The second bishop was Thomas Boland. And Boland and Vera Mullane, who is secretary, had a very close relationship. So when Boland was transferred from Paterson and was made Archbishop of Newark, he invited Vera to go with him and be his secretary in Newark. And Lewis was horrified because she was one of the only two full-time people in the office.
She had the historic memory.
Well, she knew where everything was.
Yeah.
You know, Lewis was only there 3 afternoons a week. He didn't even know where the rubber bands were. You know, and he's looking at the possibility of some new bishop coming in and him having to explain how everything works when he only knew about how half of it worked.
Yeah.
And, you know, meanwhile, Vera has taken off with the old bishop and is his secretary now at his house. So anyway, Lewis, whenever we have the gospel that we had last Sunday, you know, the steward that is being dismissed and starts writing, I think of Bill Lewis. Yeah, he goes to...
He makes friends with...
Yes.
Yeah.
Lewis goes to the bishop and says to him, Bishop, you know, Vera doesn't know how to say this to you. She's embarrassed, but she doesn't want to go with you to Newark. He says, you know, she's trying to figure out Vera didn't drive at this point. And then he says to her, she's trying to figure out a way to make the buses work from Clifton down to where the Newark office was. And it just isn't going to work. It's been hours, you know. And so she really doesn't want to go through that, but she's embarrassed and, you know, she doesn't want to hurt you and she doesn't know how to tell you. He says, no problem, you know. Meanwhile, he goes to Vera and says to her, you know, Bishop doesn't know how to say this to you. But he's discovered that there already is a secretary down there and that it would mean firing her and she would lose her job. And so he's a little embarrassed about, but he doesn't want to hurt you and he knows he made the offer and she says the same thing that he said, you know, no problem, you know, just that. So the two of them go off into the sunset thinking that the other one has canceled the deal. They didn't find out until several years later when Vera was visiting Archbishop Boland now, and Boland says to us, you know, that desk is where you would have been sitting if you had come, if you hadn't had that problem with it. And she says, what do you mean? There was no problem. I was ready to come. And she says, it was you because of the other secretary. He says, no, there was no other secretary. So Lewis is one of our shrewder.
Yeah. Wow. Well, at this point, we're probably ready for some comments or questions from our live studio audience, if anybody has anything.
Brian, your employee, you don't get to ask for.
Congrats on your retirement, Monsignor Kupke.
Yes, Monsignor Kupke retired.
Do I look retired up here?
This is, yeah.
It's Wednesday night and I'm working.
That's true. And you're working this weekend.
I want to ask, what is your greatest moment in the history of your career? If there was a Living Stones version of Monsignor Kupke's life, what would be the pinnacle moment?
One of the most unusual moments that I had as a priest was presiding at the conversion rite of the Dutch Reformed pastor of Lincoln Park. And it was he was dying, and he didn't want to die without receiving Eucharist. And so, but the ritual took place in the living room of his parsonage. So I am basically standing there, and I can look through the window, and I see his church across the street through the window. Meanwhile, I'm saying, "You want to be a Catholic, right?" That was probably the most unusual and a very moving moment in my career, anyway.
Yeah. Wow.
Thanks, Ben.
Anybody else? In the back.
Thank you, Father Paul. It's been delightful sitting here tonight. I came to the fact of the programming because I regretted the fact that there was no longer a printed beacon. I've been binging Coffee with Kupke the last, I don't know, month or so. And the interplay of Father Paul and Monsignor Kupke, I think it's great because you've got a great laid-back style of storytelling. You're animated. There's a great, interplay there.
Tell him how that started.
So we know each other a long time, Monsignor Kupke and I. So I was ordained in 1985. I think Father Ray was
73.
73. So he was 12 years older than me. And I was assigned to St. Peter's in Parsippany, and he was working at St. Pius in Montville. Another young priest was assigned to St. Peter's in Parsippany, Monsignor George Hunt. And we were all involved in a search program together with high school students. And there were 5 parishes that worked together, the priests and the young people from 5 different parishes. And at that point, Monsignor Kupke was 12 years a priest, which was like, in my view, a grand old man, because I was newly ordained. And there were a group of priests who had been doing this, and then there were younger priests who came on board, and we had different ideas. And the guys who'd been doing this for 12 years maybe were a little resistant to some of the new ideas. But I remember a meeting of the priests who were involved, kind of a contentious meeting where some of the guys who'd been involved for a long time were resistant to some of the ideas that we were suggesting, and the younger guys were suggesting maybe it was time to do things differently, and Father Ray was very, very quiet. And at the end of the meeting, I don't know if you remember this, you said, yeah, I think maybe we should think about it and try things differently. And that was when the friendship began, really. I mean, we were working together, but that was the moment that the friendship began. And so the friendship grew, and then
We started living together.
Yeah, so 5 years in, I think 5 or 6 years in, Father Dave Coppola, who was the young priest at St. Peter's with me, decided that he was moving on. And our pastor there was Monsignor Kevin Flanagan. And St. Peter's at that time was a factory. We did like weddings upon weddings and funerals upon funerals. It was huge. And Monsignor Flanagan says, you know what, Paul, I think you and I can do this alone. And I'm thinking to myself, oh my gosh, we can't do this alone. I said, Kevin, we can't do this alone. We need another parochial vicar. So we went through a series of interviews. Back then you interviewed people, and there was just nobody that was going to be a fit. So Monsignor Flanagan says, we can do this alone. And I said, well, you know what? Monsignor Kupke, he wasn't Monsignor then, Father Kupke is leaving St. Pius to go study and eventually work on the book Living Stones. I said, Monsignor Kupke part-time is worth anybody else full-time. And so let's talk to Monsignor Kupke to see if he will come and live here while he's going to school. And so I don't remember exact details, but Monsignor Kupke ended up living
I
at St.
said
Peter's.
yes because St. Peter's had a cook and they had lunch every day.
That's true. Back then, it was a different world. It was a different world. We did have a cook, and yeah, it was a different world.
So we wound up living across the hall from each other. And these conversations really started.
Way back when. And I've said this before, I don't want to embarrass him, but one of the most generous priests I've ever lived with is Monsignor Kupke, because, you know, back then we kept crazy hours, but he was a night owl. And so at the end of the night, I would walk across the hall to his room, and he would still be on the phone with a word processor, watching the news all at once, and then having a conversation with me. And he would say, I was a young priest, right? I was 6 years ordained.
Yeah.
And back then we had a 6:30 Mass at St. Peter's in Parsippany.
Ugh.
I think it's still,
Yeah.
we had a 6:30 and an 8 o'clock.
Yeah.
And when I was a young priest, 6:30 Mass was like really tough.
It still is.
I remember elevating the chalice and putting the chalice down and realizing I hadn't put any wine in the chalice and saying to the people, I have to start all over again. But Monsignor Kupke, it would be 11:30, and he'd say, Paul, you look really tired. Do you want me to take the early morning Mass for you? Who does that?
I can't believe I did it.
So anyway, we go back, well, it's 35, 40. We've known each other. I'm a priest 40 years.
Yeah, yeah.
And Monsignor Kupke was the Bishop Rodimer's priest secretary for years. And Bishop Rodimer used to host the parents of priests and seminarians for a gathering. And my parents got to know you. I got to know you as a seminarian.
Yeah.
And because of his steel trap mind and his researching, I remember the first time I went to that bishop's gathering of seminarians for Christmas. He said, you're Paul Manning, you're from Ironi, St. Lawrence, and Chester. I was like, this guy knows a lot. Yeah.
Useless information, but it makes
Yeah.
you...
Yeah.
So we've been having this conversation for a long time.
Yeah. But thanks for that. So I asked you this in one of the first episodes.
So they're supposed to be asking
Oh,
questions.
sorry. Does anybody else have anything they want to ask? Freddie Garcia.
I'm curious if you have like a successor in mind to the diocesan archivist and to really account for the history of the diocese after.
So I don't know. Can they hear it on?
Yeah.
Yeah. We're asking about the succession plan.
Have you ever seen in the movies a Viking funeral? Where they put the body on the boat and they shoot arrows and the whole boat goes up.
Flames up. Yeah.
Not in so many words. There are a couple of people who would be likely successors. There's one seminarian now who wants it bad. I mean, one of our propaedeutic seminarians, I get nervous every time he's behind me because I think he's going to knife me.
He's going to whack you?
You know, he asks me endless questions. He knows more about me than I do. And asks me all these questions, like you said in the book. Is this, you read the whole thing and memorized it, huh? But,
Well, and the fact is, Kupke makes stuff up.
no. So in one sense, yeah, there's a couple of people out there that certainly could do this. The tough part is that I've been doing it so long. I am the last, my role as archivist is the last appointment of Bishop Casey, still in effect. Bishop Casey's been dead for 30 years, but I keep his administration going because it's the last thing he did that is still going.
I think it's more than 30 years, Raymond.
Well, yeah.
Yeah.
But my point is that I got into this very, very young. And so the seminarian with a knife in my back he probably should be given the job because it takes a lifetime, to get control of the material in the archives and to know how it fits in. Part of the reason I agreed to do the podcast is because it gives me the opportunity to publicize, if you will, some of the stories that could not go into Living Stones because the book would just be like so big. If you had all these anecdotes and everything, and yet they're interesting, they give life to the history of the diocese, and so to try and keep them from being lost, I agreed to do something like this that will, keep some of the personality involved behind the history still current and still going.
I wonder if Monsignor Kupke has been waiting for someone to ask the question about succession so that he knows who it is and to whom the mantle should fall. Just wondering. I asked Monsignor Kupke in one of the first episodes, do you have a photographic memory?
Sort of. I'm good at remembering lists and incidents. I'm good at remembering small details.
And you may have seen the episode, but I asked him, how does this work? And he sees the list in his head, right? You see the list in your head? Mm-hmm. You do the presidents.
The presidents of the United States?
Right now, just for fun. Just do the presidents.
Washington, Adams, Jefferson, Madison, Monroe, Adams, Jackson, Van Buren, Harrison, Tyler, Polk.
Do you want to do the secretaries of state, or is that too?
No.
Okay.
They're not worth remembering.
But he sees the list. He can do the parishes of the diocese.
Annunciation, Wayne, Assumption, Morristown, Blessed Sacrament, Paterson, Christ the King, New Vernon, Corpus Christi, Chatham Township, Good Shepherd, Andover.
You get the idea. Yeah. That's kind of amazing. Anything else? Any other questions?
It's not so much a question, but I would like to thank you for doing this from a historic point of view, having grown up here at Holy Family, but my parents were both original families from St. Paul's and Clifton. Now that there's no one left to ask questions amongst our family for our generation going backwards, I can get
a lot of it from him. Yeah. It's funny because I often now think of the things I wish I asked my parents, Once that's gone, you miss it. So, yeah, we're grateful that Monsignor Kupke has researched so much and knows so much, and that's why we're going to continue with the podcast. And I think once we finish Chapter 10, I think we have 2 more episodes in Chapter 10. We've already started to think about what comes next. And I think one of the things we might do is bring in some of the older folks in our diocese while they're still here and pick their brains while we have a chance to do that. So we have plans in store. Coffee with Kupke does not end. So thank you one and all for being here.
Thank you for listening.
Yeah. Well, this is a lot of fun for us, and we hope a lot of fun for you. So we'll pick up with the end of Chapter 10, Living Stones. And by the way, I don't know if you know this, Living Stones is now worth a couple $100 online if you can get a copy. So we might have to do Bishop Sweeney wants him to write another book. We have the 90th anniversary of the diocese coming up. And you are retired. Thanks for being here. We'll see you again.
Thank you.